So yeah, if you don't want to be in the recording, turn off your camera, do things like that. But yeah, also some of you were introducing yourself in chat, and definitely feel free to keep using that to connect with each other and network, because that's a big part of this event. So yeah. We do have a code of conduct. We are a very inclusive community, so be nice to each other. You can read the full version or access our incident report at this link at the bottom, which is the womenwhocode.com/code of conduct, or reach out to the directors and event leaders if you do have any problems, because we want everyone to feel safe and included in these events. So tonight's event is kicking off a new series that I'm running with Women Who Code Denver, Frontend kind of study series. So it's going to be twice a month. This one is part of the Technical Voices, where I try to bring in cool people in the front end to either talk about technologies they're using or what their job is like, anything that might be interesting to you guys. So definitely let me know so I can look for speakers that you know, want to talk about the things you want to hear about. So let me know. Tonight, Katie is joining us from the Portland area, and she's going to be talking about rapid prototyping, and I'll be talking a little bit about CSS Animations. The other part of this event is puppies and portfolios, which is less about having a speaker stand up in front of you and more about helping you build your portfolio site. Usually my dogs come and hang out at a coffee shop when we do it, but we're gonna transition it to online and see what happens. So that will be posted soon, but definitely keep an eye out for that. We also have a reoccurring career returnship event that Women Who Code Denver runs, which is pretty cool if you're kind of getting back into tech, if you've taken some time off, and they do some really cool projects, definitely worth checking out. And our monthly JavaScript in Boulder event, which is the first Monday of every month, but currently online. So definitely check that out if you're doing JavaScript stuff. And you can always go to our meetup page to find out more about different events we have coming up. So I think with that, I'm going to pass it over to Katie and let her present on rapid prototyping. Katie was my team lead when I worked at Nike a while back. Definitely did all my training and taught me all those super cool things. So I'm super excited to have her here tonight to share with you guys.
Hi, thank you for that introduction, Michelle. I feel like a little misleading though, because you definitely taught me just as much. So thank you though.
That's
hi.
how teams work, right? we all learn from each other.
It's true. So hi everyone, and thanks for letting me join you tonight. I wish that I could go to the Puppies and Portfolios events, but no one's going anywhere, and I'm in Portland. So yeah, I'm gonna just stop talking and start screen sharing and try and talk about prototyping here. So one second while I figure that out. Okay, so cool. So here's my, get into it. Yeah, so can everyone see my slides? Am I good? All right. Oh, and I'll try and keep an eye on the chat too. Maybe being a little generous with myself, I might not be able to do that. But we can ask questions and stuff throughout. Feel free to like unmute yourself and interrupt me. Yeah, so
eye on it for you. Katie.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about prototyping. You might be familiar with prototyping already. Uh-oh, I don't know how to advance my slides. Shoot, I thought I was going to be so slick and had tested everything out ahead of time. Oh, okay. So first I'm going to, wait, how do I go back? Oh my gosh. Guys, I'm sorry. So unprofessional. This is my dog, by the way. I couldn't share a photo in the Slack, so this is Dexter. I just wanted everyone to be aware that that's who I'm hunkering down with. He's really helping me stay sane. It's great. So what is a prototype? I think that this word can mean a lot of things to different people. It's definitely a word that we've borrowed from kind of more of the physical design realm. But the way that I like to think about a prototype is an experiment built to test a design hypothesis. When we design anything, we're making all kinds of assumptions about how people will use it. And I've found that the quickest way to check your assumptions is to get that product in the hands of a consumer and see how they're actually using it. It can be so enlightening to see that your assumptions were totally off base or to prove them right. And I like prototyping because it makes that piece of the process happen a lot earlier on. So why prototype? I stole this quote from Katarina Pon, who I'm sure Jordan knows her, but she was the director is the director for the Portland area Women Who Code chapter. And so you all know the phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words, but a prototype is worth 1,000 wireframes. So I just think that prototypes require designers, engineers, and product managers to start asking each other kind of really critical questions earlier on in the process and start iterating sooner. I think if we look at wireframes, that's more of a passive experience, whereas when you have a prototype in your hands, you're really interacting with it, questioning it. Yeah, I think they're really valuable. So I'm going to talk through kind of an example of where I think prototyping, like how to use it. Imagine that so we all know kind of like pinching to zoom, like that's very common on the web these days. But imagine that you were being asked to build the first iteration of pinch to zoom, and like some designer was talking to you and they were like, oh, it's kind of like you do this with your fingers and it gets bigger, and maybe they give you comps. Honestly, these comps are maybe more helpful than what you'd get. Like, what if it was just like, I don't know, an image and then a slightly larger image? That doesn't really tell the whole story. You know, maybe you'd get a list of requirements, like, but again, like it doesn't really, I don't know, I think this sort of handoff would be a little tricky to execute on for something that's as like physical and like gesture based as pinch to zoom. So like, what if instead you got something like this? Is this playing for you? It's not actually playing for me. But on my screen, on one of my screens, this is like a hand doing one of these and it's actually zooming in. I don't know if that's what you see or not, but I hope it is. Okay, so another reason why I like this, like in addition to that sort of like just ability to get really crisp on requirements without a formal handoff, like if you're rapid prototyping, you can be kind of like jamming with designers and engineers and product and like really getting a feel for what you're building before it comes time to actually build it. Another thing I like to use prototyping for is user testing. So this is a button, as you can see, and we put this button in front of people and it was sort of confusing for them. What does this button do? Well, it has a price on it, but what's gonna happen when I click that button? So eventually we kind of went with something that had a clearer call to action than just a price tag. We also deal with localization a lot. I should know the number of countries that we have e-commerce in, but I don't off the top of my head, but it's a lot. And a lot of them use characters that we're unfamiliar with or have words that are maybe longer than our English words that we're used to designing in. So we have a pseudo localization kind of plugin that will automatically, like rapidly replace all of the strings with this sort of pseudo localized version that might show how it could display in other languages. And that's prototypes are really useful for that. So who should prototype? I mean, I think everyone should prototype a little bit, but designers can prototype, developers could prototype, and then my favorite prototyper is something that I like to call a dev-ziner. This is just a hybrid of a designer and a developer. It's maybe like a designer who likes to write a little bit of code, or a developer who loses their mind if the fonts don't look perfect. That's the person who I think will bring the most to prototyping and also enjoy doing it the most. So who is prototyping? Well, there are a lot of companies that are doing this. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but these are the ones that I'm aware of where either I've talked to someone there and I know that they have an actual team dedicated to prototyping, or I've seen job postings there where they're specifically looking for a prototyper. But you don't necessarily need to be working for a company that calls you a prototyper in order to be doing prototyping. I think there are principles from it that you can roll into your work, even if your main job isn't prototyping. And I wanted to play this little video. It's only 3 minutes long, but this is from a company called Framer, who builds a prototyping tool, and I will touch on that in my list of prototyping tools in a second. And then they worked with Spotify to create this video, and they're honestly probably better at explaining this than I am, so hopefully this works. Let me just exit slide mode and play this video, and hopefully the sound and everything works, so bear with me.
Spotify definitely has had to scale very rapidly over the last few years. It's been an opportunity for us giving designers and developers and product managers all of the tools to really solve bigger things. That's part of our DNA, I think, here at Spotify.
Our mission is to work with teams across R&D to deliver high-fidelity prototypes. We also work with the embedded designers to create toolkits and documentation that make prototyping easier and faster, whether that be for us or for the designers or even engineers. We built out our design system into FramerX so that all of the core components of our app were just ready to go. It's our hope that teams will be a little bit less reliant on us to build these prototypes, but they really haven't had the power unless we helped them out or if they had help from an engineer. I think with this toolkit, we're kind of putting the power into their hands.
We're moving towards a point where multiple people can work on the same project at the same time. This has never really been possible with other prototyping tools in a very simple way. By moving towards components and prepackaged behaviors, we can develop tools for others to use or work on pieces of a prototype separately and then assemble them together into the final piece.
I see that that kind of workflow being very valuable and playing out where a certain number of people build and maintain components that other people can just pull into their projects and use without having to think about what goes into building it out. Color extraction, for instance, is a huge part of the Spotify visual language within the app. Being able to pull in something like that from the team store and just dropping into your project, telling the component which image to extract color from, knowing that it will work, like an actual simulation of what a Spotify experience might be like, is what we're aiming for.
With FramerX, the thing that I'm most excited about is the fact that what you design and what the developer has are in sync. Because if you're importing the actual React components, you know they're going to look exactly the same. And so you can have that conversation earlier, and you can have it once, and then you know you're both on the same page.
I think the industry still has this kind of handoff, handover process, right? Which is the big H. I think what's different about a tool like FramerX is that handover, instead of it being a me to you or you to me, it's let's just do this together. With that comes more collaboration, more empathy, tooling that embraces code under the covers and design on top. I think that brings us much closer to that kind of amazing place that we all want to be.
It's going to allow us to move faster. It's going to allow us to communicate with one another better. It's going going to give us kind of this foundation to stand on, we're really able to kind of create like a facsimile of that personalized view for our users, and being able to use that to kind of judge some of the design decisions we're making is so critical.
When you just show somebody a screen that they have no emotional connection with, especially in a music product, they just give you like very generic feedback. That's like why I wanted to learn Framer, because I feel like the more power I have as a writer to be able to go in and make changes or suggestions within the tool, the more likely that I'll actually be able to fully collaborate with design.
We're all in, our own autonomous teams, and we want to be free to be able to experiment and like get really in-depth expertise in our one specific area. But being able to share components across teams will just get us so much further in keeping that same shared visual and interactive language.
Okay, let me go back to my slides. So sorry, I'm not trying to sell you Framer. I do not work for Framer. I don't even use Framer. But I just feel like watching that like promotional video is sort of like a window into what prototyping feels like and kind of some of the promise of prototyping. And also Framer is probably really cool. I don't know. I haven't used it in like 5 years, but it was pretty cool when I last used it, but not quite what I needed. So feel free to go try it. I don't know if it costs money. I don't know much about Framer, but seems neat. And Spotify, actually, they seem like really cool thought leaders in the prototyping space. If you're interested in learning more, I haven't like really dug into their blog and if they have any posts or anything about prototyping, but they were organizing a prototyping summit that was supposed to be hosted at Facebook, and I actually got invited to it, and then all of this happened, and I think it's postponed indefinitely, but that sort of made me feel like, oh, there's some cool prototyping things happening there. So yeah, they might be cool. Their design blog might be cool to check out if you're wanting to learn more. So yeah, here are some prototyping tools. Some of them require code, some of them don't. I've used some of these, but I guess my favorite prototyping tool currently would probably just be like React, something like Code Sandbox that's easy to share, and I don't really have to like spin up my own React app or think about Babel or anything like that. I really think the best prototyping tool is going to be the one that's fastest for you. So if there's something that doesn't require code that you're faster in, then that's probably the best tool. For me, it's just like quicker to write some code than to spend time like figuring out how InVision works, like learning a new UI and stuff. So yeah, those are some good tools to get started with. There are not many downsides of prototyping, in my opinion, but there are a few little struggles that I've run into, probably like calling myself a prototyper for the last 6+ years. So I think it can be really hard to measure the positive impact that prototyping has on a new feature or on a new project. Like, how do I tell you about the work that I prevented you from doing later on in the process? I haven't figured it out yet. And I can't just like walk into meetings and be like, you're welcome, because no one likes that. But I'm still trying to like get the right, just really express to people, like, these are all the JIRA tickets you didn't have to complete thanks to what my team did. And so maybe it's a lifelong journey, or maybe I will find some really cool like solution that other prototypers out there have found. I think intuitively, it's like we know if we've struggled through like incomplete requirements or a bunch of rework after something is already in the execution phase, we know how painful that is. But I would just love to find a way to really quantify it and demonstrate it. And then not all companies are going to have steady prototyping work. I think that unless you're a really large company with a lot of digital products, or like if you're really trying to like change up the way things work online, it might be kind of a an incomplete workload. So I think that's part of why I think that having prototyping skills that sort of supplement another skill set can be really nice. But it's a fun area to stretch into. And then the other thing that I will say is, like, I've experienced a little bit of an identity crisis as a prototyper, because I think that a lot of us know what a really great designer looks like, and we know what a really great like JavaScript engineer looks like. Like, we can say like, oh yeah, they really know their stuff. But since I don't even know a lot of other prototypers, I haven't quite figured out like who's a really great prototyper to look up to, or like, how do I know that I'm like really excelling in this field when it's not quite like clear to me what this field is. So sometimes I feel like it's a little bit of a gray area, and hopefully I'm trying to shape that into what I think it should be. But I guess I just wish I knew what that, like, I don't know, super senior prototyper looked like. Yeah, so that is the end of my slides. This is how to, oh, that's not my real email address. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. Yeah, that email address is not gonna get you in touch with me. Whoopsie. It's kind of like a hybrid of my 2 email addresses. Can I fix this here? How do I fix it? Yes, okay, that's better. Yeah. So anyway, and I can share my slides if that's helpful. Yeah, okay, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now. Hopefully everyone got the actual email address if they're interested. Yeah, that's it. Oh, now I'm looking at the chat. Okay. Any questions?
I really feel you on the identity crisis with being a prototyper.
Right. It's like, I'm really good at what I do, but like, don't ask me about prototypical inheritance in JavaScript right now.
Looks like there was a question for you. Anne is asking, how does prototyping fit into an agile methodology? And Allison asked about if you would talk about your journey to becoming a prototyper.
Okay, so Anne first. We are trying to figure that out right now. I don't know if this is like just a resourcing thing. Like, my team, since we didn't have like one product to work, so I work on a team of myself and 3 other prototypers. And in addition to prototyping, we also maintain the global style sheet for Nike's e-commerce site. So that's sort of like the opposite of prototyping. It's like we write like this really quick, like throwaway code that never sees the light of day. And then like we maintain this thing that like, if it breaks, our site will look terrible and not function. But it kind of works for us because we're all sort of like developers with a lot of eye for detail. But for whatever reason, for the longest time, we did not have a Scrum Master, and we weren't being very good about like keeping track of our work in tickets. Like, it's such a small team, we kind of be like, okay, you're working on that. It was a lot more verbal communication. And so now we recently got a Scrum Master, and we are kind of a mystery for her. So we use a Kanban workflow. We use what we call a Kanban workflow. I don't know if it actually is that. And we've had a hard time kind of like breaking up prototyping tasks into those manageable pieces like you would make for a ticket on most teams that I've worked on. So I think we're still figuring out what that workflow looks like. Yeah, any ideas about Agile and how to do it better would be very welcome. I also think that I work for a company that maybe like uses Agile but doesn't totally practice it. Like, I think there's some waterfall in there for sure. So my journey to becoming a prototyper started back when I was in undergrad studying landscape architecture. I know it doesn't sound at all related to what I do now, but a big piece of what I was studying was sort of like, what do people do in different spaces? How do you design a space so that it's nice for people to use, they want to be there, or they want to use it in the way that you're expecting them to do. And then graduating in 2008 meant that I did not find a job in anything related to my degree or construction at all. Nobody was really building anything back then. I wanted to do urban planning, and like entire urban planning departments were being laid off. So after trying a lot of different things, I decided to use the Adobe Creative Suite skills I'd learned in college, and now through a few different courses and like some self-teaching and some mentoring, now I do web development. And I just happened to be contacted by a recruiter for this. I always sort of knew I was like somewhere in between a designer and a developer, and I wasn't the best designer, and I was sort of more drawn to code. And like when I was maybe like 2 years into writing code and building websites, a recruiter from Nike contacted me and was telling me about this prototyping position. And I was like, wait, that's a thing? That's me. That's totally what I do. So it's kind of perfect. Like a day-to-day, I don't code as much as I used to when I was like, before I got a promotion to be a lead engineer. And now I just feel like I go to meetings and talk about prototyping and like try to like speculate about how long it will take. But I feel like there's a lot of coding involved in prototyping, but it's not, for me at least, it tends to be more like, oh, how do I make that animation look really slick? And it's less like, there's not a lot of unit testing. There's not the same kind of like rigor around code quality that you would find maybe on a more typical engineering team. We review each other's projects, but we don't necessarily review the code because a lot of the code doesn't end up making it into production. And yeah, we don't have to think as much. We also work closely with a team that builds shared components, and they have to think so much about like, oh, is this actually like gonna work? Is it usable? And we try to like bring things down to earth a little bit, but also sometimes we're just up in the clouds building something that like maybe doesn't have like a path to production currently. Oh, this question, do you have any tips to not overdo it in prototyping? Can you clarify that at all? Do you mean like not spend too much time in the prototyping phase? Yeah. I think for that, I have seen people do what I would say overdoing it in prototyping, which is at one point we were trying to make these really perfect prototypes that could almost like be like a blueprint for building something in production, and we'd hand it off to an engineering team and just say like, build it exactly like this. And that didn't work. Like, engineers didn't want to be told exactly how to build things by people who weren't actually like in their code base. And then I think that it's something that shouldn't be perfect. Like, the goal is and this is totally my point of view, but when I say like, this is something that should be like an experiment to prove a hypothesis, I think you run the experiment as quickly as you can, and then you learn from it, and then you move on. So I think that prototypes shouldn't be too precious or perfect. I also think that like sometimes quantity is better than quality. Sometimes you want to like go through a bunch of different ideas and just like get a bunch of reactions to them, and they don't need to be super perfect. Do you have anything your team includes in prototypes, like tests, that you feel helps the teams and programmers that can continue working with your prototypes? We don't have unit tests. I think the biggest sort of like quality pieces we have are, we have this plugin that does that like pseudo translation work that's like I showed earlier. And then we also we'll try and run through with like accessibility testing code just to make sure like we're not doing some crazy like low contrast type, or like, you know, it doesn't catch everything. And, you know, like if an image that comes from production data is missing an alt tag, we're not going to catch that, but we'll definitely, like, we could run through it with voiceover and make sure that like we're not doing anything too crazy with accessibility. How do you avoid the problem of when customers or management see a prototype and think the final result is practically done, especially when prototyping is done by the same developers as the end result, so there's not a handover to the second team? Yeah, that, I feel like for me, that's been again about like being really clear about what our team does and what we don't do. And in some cases, so yeah, our last manager who left, I think 2018, early 2018, was kind of like positioning our team to try and be like everything to everyone. And I disagreed with that. And then I feel like in walking that back, well, I feel like in trying to like deliver this like fully featured thing that really wasn't the right place for that, yeah, people would get too attached to it, and then they'd be like, well, why can't I see it in production? Like the prototypers built it, but it's like they're kind of playing by a different set of rules, and they have different constraints than something that's not built off of real data, real services. I guess it's just communication, and then me trying to really get my point of view out there about what the point of a prototype is. I can't say that I've done that successfully, though. I'm trying. Cool.
Do you have an example of a prototype that you've maybe created that you could share with us if we have time?
That's a good, I don't think I can share anything except for like the little snippets in the slide deck. I'm trying to think. Yeah, I feel like I'm probably not supposed to. Sorry.
Maybe for future presentations.
Yeah, we like to be kind of weirdly secretive, and it's annoying.
Looks like you got one other question.
Oh yeah, so what code besides HTML and CSS should I learn to help prototype? I mean, JavaScript, sometimes I'll just use a little bit of jQuery to like fire off animations and stuff. And then I think that knowing React is really helpful, or kind of whatever framework the prototype is going to be built in. I personally see value, I haven't tried this out yet, but I see value in getting to a point, and maybe this is what that Framer tool is trying to accomplish, but if you could like pull in shared components that are already completed into your prototype, instead of like reinventing the wheel, if you have like a set of components that's written in some framework, I think it makes sense to use those as much as possible. Okay, I will hand it back to Jordan. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much for sharing, Katie. Cool, so I will share my screen and talk about some animation stuff. different set of slides now. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about CSS animation. When I originally built the slides for this talk, I got really annoyed with my tool because it wouldn't let me do animations. So I have some of the animations off in like little separate code pens, but I loved this animation that I made originally and then got really upset that I couldn't use it in the actual presentation. So code pen, not quite the same, but at least you can see my car drive around. Yeah. So hello, I am Jordan. I've introduced myself a little bit. I'm hosting this event and being the second speaker. I'm a front-end software engineer at Brandwise and a new network director for the Women Who Code Boulder, Denver chapter. My favorite things are my dogs that have popped in at the beginning. Everything CSS, if I could write just CSS, that's what I would do, but I haven't quite found that job yet. And rubber duck debugging is fun, and my desk at work is overflowing with ducks now because of this. It's a little bit ridiculous. I think we were up to like 45 ducks at one point because people from around the office just started bringing more ducks in. So my desk is a pond apparently for ducks. You can find me online pretty much anywhere, just at mjordancodes or my website, which is mjordan.codes, where the little fish is actually animated, whereas it is not in the slides. So before I jump in, please interrupt me. Ask me questions, share ideas, demand more information if I'm not being clear, and start a conversation, because this is really about you learning, not me talking to myself. So kind of wanted to talk about what actually is a CSS animation. Basically, it's a way to animate transitions. So taking an element in CSS and changing it from one thing to another over some period of time, so that it's not just like this weird sudden flashy change, but has some kind of gradualness to it where you can see the progress. So whenever I'm looking at a new piece of technology or a new thing, I like to understand why I would use it, because that kind of helps, for me at least, kind of dictate how I need to study it, how I need to learn it, and things like that. So I wanted to kind of take a look at that. A lot of companies use, kind of have these design systems, and they'll talk about motion and animation. This quote's from the material design documents that Google puts out. But it's saying, you know, motion can guide the user's attention. It's going to provide continuity when you change things, when you move things from before and after, so that it's not just a sudden change, but really explains the change and what's happening. Let me see if I can. Yeah, so some of the benefits of motion when used correctly, it can really help to explain different relationships and hierarchy on a site, like what's most important, what do you need to pay attention to first, or how do these two things connect. It can also do kind of cause and effect. So one of my favorite examples is, and I wish I could find it, but there's like a little button and it has a submarine on it and it says submit. And when you click it, the water slowly goes up and like you can see the button filling up, the submarine goes down under the water in the button, and then it just kind of blinks out and it's an island and it says your form was submitted. So it's like kind of a fun little animation that explains like, hey, I'm sending this form, because as a developer that can take a minute. It's not like an instant thing, but you have to explain that to your users. So that was just kind of a fun way to use some animation to explain that instead of just like a loader or saying, please wait, we're submitting. So things like that can be kind of fun and really explains like what's going on. It can also be used for feedback to explain to a user like, hey, you can't do that. So sometimes it might be like if you're trying to hit the checkout button, but you don't have anything in your cart, maybe the empty cart icon shakes or something to draw your attention to it. Or if you have an error message that comes in, have it animate in some way. to really draw the attention to the user, like, hey, you're doing something that you can't do. Why don't you try this instead? And again, kind of in the same way, just to guide users where you want them to go to kind of help with the flow of the page. My chat window disappeared. There we go. Ha. Cool. So kind of that's a little bit of the why, but like, when would you actually use it? Without going into overkill. My favorite place to use it is in portfolio sites and sites where you get to have a lot of fun. But you really can use it anywhere. Any site can benefit from using animation as long as you don't overdo it. Then you just kind of cause seizures with your website, which generally is not the point. You know, as you're finding different places to use it, just a few things to keep in mind. Less is more. You know, one really good, solid, simple animation is a lot better than 16 running around your site causing all kinds of problems. So, you know, really think about which ones are going to have the most impact and focus on those. And every animation you create on your site should have a clear purpose. And that can be kind of like we were talking about, to inform or communicate, explain to the user what they need to do or give feedback on their behavior, to draw attention to something that you really want them to pay attention to, whether it's like a call to action button or like, hey, look, fancy thing, whatever it is. That way, it can really help your site appear kind of more modern and up to date and give it a really nice polished look without a whole lot of extra effort. And my favorite reason, which is just purely for delight. That is a totally valid reason to add animation, as long as you keep in mind the first rule of less is more and you don't go overboard with it. Which is why I get away with having a fish swimming back and forth on my portfolio website that has nothing else to do with fish. So kind of gives you a little bit of why and when to use when you would use these animations, but the interesting part, the how, like, how do we actually do this? Give me technical stuff. Before I can really explain that, slight detour into how browsers render style, because it's really important to understand that part so that you can figure
I guess I'm the host now.
We lost Jordan.
Yeah, let's wait a few minutes for
I
her
need
come
to
back.
know how browsers render style.
I know. 1 second, guys.
I think she must.
Brady, what tool do you use to prototype?
Great question. So I use a tool that we created in-house. I don't recommend creating your own prototyping tool. There are plenty of good ones out there. I don't know why we did this. I mean, I guess like it was partially for single sign-on. And then also our tool, we've built in some localization features so we can, like, if we have a project that has been translated, we could bring all of those strings into the prototype. And it's funny because okay, so I am on this team of, there are 4 of us. We're all like the front endiest of front end engineers. And then we have this like crazy Node app to maintain that has like, it's got a database, it's got like, it publishes things to S3, it's got Elasticsearch, it's crazy. It's got Lambdas. And so it's been really fun in some ways because I have really gotten to stretch myself into more of a like full stack role, and I've learned a whole lot. But it means that I don't really prototype as much as I maintain the tool that everyone else uses to prototype. So yeah, we should probably just be using CodePen or Framer or something like that. I'm gonna upload my slides really quickly here and then throw them a link in the chat. I'm gonna do a PDF of the slides, so it might be missing some animations or something, sorry.
Jordan said she's trying to get back on. Hopefully it will be quick. I guess she lost her internet connection for a second.
Oh, that's terrible. This is a scary time to be without internet for sure.
I know.
Our power flickered the other day and we lose power. I live kind of in the country and we lose power often enough. I was like, that could be bad. That could be really bad.
Katie, has Nike been impacted by COVID in terms of hiring at this point?
So far, I don't think we're doing any interviews right now. I think everything is kind of like slowed down in terms of like I haven't heard the actual term hiring freeze, but like, I just would imagine that everyone has slowed down on that. But yeah, I don't know. It's a little scary. It's because, we like rely a lot on like the economy as a whole. I mean, like who's going to be like buying $120 yoga pants if they're, worried about their job. So it's definitely a scary time for everyone, I think. But they've also been like a great company to work for in terms of like supporting people, like, and like offering kind of like ways to get help, like emotional help. And just like, I feel very supported by my manager and leaders, and they created and donated a bunch of personal protective equipment to one of the local hospitals. So that's cool. But I don't know. It's also like, why does an athletic apparel company have to do that? Like, I don't want to go off on a tangent about that, but.
Someone asked a question in the chat. I think maybe to you, Katie.
Oh, new front-end developers. I mean, my career path was kind of weird because I was self-taught, and it was, so when I was learning all of this stuff, it was right before there were lots of boot camps in Portland. This would have been like 2010, 2011. And so there were a ton of like, there were boot camps, I think, in like the Bay Area at that time, and also in Seattle, but there weren't any in Portland yet. And honestly, like I wish I'd done a boot camp, because I think I would have gotten a better, like we would have focused more on like what I really needed to learn in order to get a job. But I will say that, oh, I do have something. I have some concrete advice. I'm like trying to think back to this time. So one thing that I really recommend is like all of the networking. I just think that like, and I think in general, if you're doing any kind of like instruction in learning how to code, maybe not if you're getting a computer science degree, but if you're doing, oh, Jordan's back, hello. I'll just finish my thought really quickly. Sorry, Jordan.
Thanks for filling in while
I took over. But so I think anytime you're being taught by people who are in the field, like ask them all of the questions, like they're not gonna mind talking about it. And like for me, like I just got a really clear picture of like what kind of company I wanted to work for, and like the role that I wanted, because like my teachers, when I took kind of random like night school classes at the college, but they were all, you know, they were all professionals who were teaching random classes as a side hustle. And so they could tell me all about like what they're looking for, what they do at work. Like I just got a really good feel for what life was like out there. And then the other thing I did that I would really recommend is, this was 2013, maybe 2012. I had been like doing kind of projects here and there for people. I had a very small portfolio, but I'd done a few things. And I hired a recruiter who was like a technical recruiter who was also a career coach. And I believe I paid her like $250, and she like logged into my LinkedIn, like did some fancy like magic to make it more attractive to recruiters. And she redid my resume, and she kind of like gave me a little bit of a pep talk, some do's and don'ts. And then like suddenly I got all these recruiters emailing me and like messaging me on LinkedIn. So I think like hiring a coach who knows what they're doing is really helpful, because you can, oh my gosh, a dachshund. Okay, yeah, that would be my advice. And maybe you get some of that if you're in a boot camp. They might have someone who can help you out with that. You might not need to pay an extra person. That is all. Sorry, Jordan.
No, sorry, thank you. My internet decided to die, so I'm glad that you were able to fill some time. I'm hotspotting off my phone now because the internet is still not back up, so hopefully that works. My phone wants to make noise at me. That's awesome. Be quiet, phone. Just give me your internet. Cool. Let me see if I can get my screen sharing again.
I try to make you the co-host again, so hopefully that works.
Cool.
Let me know if I need to make something else happen.
Will do. I think that got my screen up, so I should be good. Yeah, I think I was starting to talk about how renders render styles, which is important to kind of understand so that you know what things you should and shouldn't animate. So the first kind of step that it does, the style calculations, is when it's figuring out what CSS rules are going to apply to what elements. And it can start to calculate some of the things that you use. So some of the values that you're using, you might be using percentages, or you might even be using the CSS calc function. So this is when it starts to actually figure that out and turn it into numbers that the browser can really start to work with and understand how those different pieces have to go. Then it goes into kind of the layout phase, which is when the browser is starting to calculate how much space it needs for each element. how much width it's going to take up, where on the screen it needs to go, and just kind of really figuring that out. And once it figures out one element, it has to figure out the next element, and it might have to go back and recalculate because different elements can be sized based on parents or things like that, or just siblings can be like, I'm going to take up way more space, so now you have to get real small. So it has to kind of figure all those different pieces out. And then it goes into kind of this paint step where it actually starts filling in the pixels. So this is kind of where it actually starts drawing out the text and colors and images and pretty much all the visual parts. And it does this in multiple surfaces, kind of like layers, that it'll eventually kind of stick together and render onto the screen. But it does this in these layers and kind of figuring all this stuff out still. So then the last step is kind of the composite step, where it takes all of these layers and puts them together in the right order. And this is kind of just where a lot of the last bits of CSS get applied. I'll share my link to the slides after, but if you go down, it has all kinds of information that I just didn't want to throw up on the screen to be distracting, but it is there as a resource for you guys. So kind of looking at that, you want to stay as close to the composite layer as possible when you're doing animations, so that the browser has to do the least amount of work possible. So you want to avoid layout properties, which are things like this. So you don't want to use the width or the height property to change the size of an element. You know, you don't want to use the position to change where it is. Different things like that, because that's going to require a lot of steps for the browser to go back through. So these are the ones that you should avoid at all costs. Oops, wrong way. There we go. You also want to avoid painting properties when you can, but you know, do them when you need to, when that's kind of what your animation requires. I'm really bad at listening to this. I love using animation to change color, so I do that all the time, but maybe I should come up with some other way to do it, or at least pay more attention to how often I do it. But so that's all the things you shouldn't animate, which is pretty much everything. So what can you actually animate cheaply that the browser doesn't have to do a lot of extra work on? I kind of mentioned you don't want to use position to move it around, but you can use this transform and translate to move an item because it doesn't change the flow of the document. This item kind of gets broken out when you use this property, and it's its own thing. So the browser just has to deal with that, and it doesn't care what anything else is doing. Rather than using height and width to change the size of an element, you should use the transform scale to make it larger or smaller. Again, this breaks it out into its kind of own flow, which keeps it easy for the browser to manage. You can use the rotation to spin it around, wiggle it, jiggle it, whatever you want to do, which can be pretty fun. And the last one is you can change the opacity. So rather than changing like display show or display none or anything like that, using the opacity to change whether or not the element is visible can be really helpful, because then it doesn't have to rebuild the thing when it shows it because it's already there. It's just hidden. So that's, and it doesn't seem like this is a lot because there's so many properties that CSS has, and then it's going to tell you only do these 4 things. But I would say whenever possible, use these 4 things and use all the other properties sparingly. And these are actually pretty powerful, and they can do a lot more than you would originally think. I linked an article that kind of goes into it a little bit more. You can definitely check out later. Okay, for realsies, show me code. Technical, stop talking about ideas, something like that. There we go. So this is like a super simple transition. Basically the most simple animation you can create, totally using properties you're not supposed to, because I'm really good at hypocritical stuff, I guess. But that's all good. So in this one, kind of we have this div that's just a box, a square basically. And I'm doing this simple transition on it, and I'm saying transition 1000 milliseconds. So that's how long I want this to take to go from where it is to where I want it to go. And the item I'm changing is the border radius, and I'm triggering it with a hover state. So obnoxiously simple, but it turns it into a circle. By putting the transition on the main element instead of on the hover state, it animates both directions. I've spent a lot of time putting it on the hover trigger and being really annoyed when it just snaps back when I hover out. So if you put it on the main element, it'll transition both ways. Good tip, hopefully.
Great tip.
But that's kind of limiting because you're only really just telling it like, hey, change to this thing. And you only have control in that case on like how long it takes to do the change. So CSS provides this thing, these at keyframes that kind of give you a little bit more control. So they're basically like a way to define the steps that your animation should take. In this previous example, I never define what the border radius is. I just take the browser's default at the beginning. But maybe you want to define how it should start and how it should end, you know, more explicitly. Or you want to add multiple steps in, more than just start and end. Maybe you want it to turn into a circle and then kind of back to a square, and then you want it to spin around and whatever. So like there's all these different steps, and you don't want to have like, there's no way to explain, do this and then this and then this in the way we were looking at it first. So you have to use these keyframes for that. The most basic example just uses from and to as keywords. So with that, this is the same animation, just a little bit more code to get there. So I've defined this at keyframes, and I've called it simple keyframe animation. And then I link it to my element with the hover trigger by saying animation name and then just typing in the same name that I gave the at keyframes. And I gave it a duration here of 5 seconds. And I'm saying go from this point where the border radius is 0 to where the border radius is 100%. So it's going to do the same thing a little bit slower. But since the way I did it, it just does that really annoying snapback thing, which is mostly because I have it on a hover trigger. But it basically is doing the same kind of thing. It's just a little bit more explicit here. And this gets more fun as you go through because like this was the basic example where you just use the from and the to, but you can also use percents to get more control and add more steps in. So instead of just the start and the end, you can have all these intermediate steps. And you can also, when you're doing it this way, you can update multiple properties in each step. So this is kind of jumping up a little bit. I'm using percents here instead of from and to. But I link it the same way with the animation name, the same 5 seconds, but now I'm changing it one corner at a time. Kind of does this little like gooey thing that I think is so much fun. And then I have this code pen where I started playing with a lot more of it. So I'm changing like the border radius, I'm changing the color, I'm rotating it all at the same time. So it kind of does all these different things. But the code still stays pretty clean, and you can see the different steps. And you don't have, like everything that you want to change, like all the properties that I'm changing, I don't have to change on every step. So like border radius, I change everywhere. But the rotate, I only have on the last step at 100%. So I'm saying So you don't have to break it down all the way if you don't want to be as specific. So like I could change different pieces at different points, but it just kind of shows a little bit more of a complicated example that I didn't want to pull into slides because slides doesn't like animation. Or it doesn't like your own custom animation, it just wants you to use their animation features.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Is changing the filter like you're doing, is that a cheaper or more performant way than changing the color? Or
most of the things I've looked at have said yes, but not all of them. I think, you know, and some of it's also going to depend on what browser you're using, because they'll render things differently. But I do believe that filter is considered a better alternative because it's not going back as far. It was also fun because then I didn't have to like come up with a whole bunch of different hex codes. I could just kind of rotate it around and get lots of different colors that way. But yeah. So this is just going to be a whole lot of text. So these are, I just think it's really helpful to kind of know what tools are available to you. So these are kind of the animation properties, and we'll talk a little bit about each one. So animation name kind of goes on the main element that you want to apply the animation to. And it's going to match the named @keyframe set that we defined. So that's just the way that you kind of connect the steps to where they need to be applied. You get animation duration, which kind of like it sounds, defines how long the animation should take to go from kind of step one to the end. So how long the whole thing should take. You know, each step can take its own amount of time, but this is the whole thing overall. You can do an animation delay, and this will be kind of from either how long between when the element is loaded and when the animation starts, or if it's like on a hover, it might be like you hover on it and then it waits a second or two before it starts if you want to have a delay for whatever reason. I see the delay a lot when you're like loading a page and you want to make sure that it waits a second before it starts moving everything around, and pieces like that. Or if you have animations that are triggered based on your scroll position, they might have a delay on them and pieces there. You can do an animation direction. So you can write your steps kind of, you know, here how we did it, where I'm going from 0 up to 100, but I can change my animation direction and have it go from 100 to 0. Or I can have it kind of alternate back and forth. So the first time it goes through, it'll play from 0 to 100, and then it'll play again and it'll go from 100 back to 0, and then kind of that way so that it flows back and forth instead of just a jarring change to whatever the beginning was when it's set to kind of iterate indefinitely. Animation iteration count, which allows you to set how many times the animation should run. By default, it just runs once and then it's done. And it kind of just goes back to whatever it was initially, which is probably not what you want. But you can change this. You can use any valid number to set a number of times, or you can say infinite, which is what I did in this example here, because I just wanted to just keep going in a circle forever and just kind of be this weird thing to look at. So you can do this animation play state, which allows you to kind of pause, play, stop the animation. So you can have other things that trigger it, and you can create a play button. So pressing the play button will, just with CSS, you don't have to go into all this JavaScript, will start the animation that you've designed, or can be used to pause it and things like that if you want to stop it in the middle. There's also these animation timing functions. which kind of took a while for my non-math brain to wrap my head around. But it can change the established preset acceleration curves, which basically means things in life don't always move at exactly one speed. Like it might start out slow and then get fast, or start out fast and then get slow, or it might do this like weird bounce thing at the end. And kind of using these acceleration curves, you can mathematically change how the animation works. Instead of it all being at one speed, which is the kind of linear, you can have it ease in, ease out, and do things like that, which might make your animations look a little bit more natural. I don't recommend writing the curve yourself. I recommend using a calculator. There's like a whole bunch of them online that you can just like play with it and it'll come up with exactly what that needs to be for you. Because I'm not a math person. I can figure out, I can play visually with it and figure out what I want, but I'm never gonna write that equation. And that's okay. And you also get this animation fill mode. So I was talking a little bit earlier with the direction. You know, when it plays through once, when it finishes the animation, it's just going to swap back to whatever it was in its initial state. And that might not be what you want. You might want it to stay at its end state when it's done, because it's transitioning from one thing to another. So you can use this animation fill mode to set values to change what it looks like before or after the animation, to kind of set those states. So they're all a little funky, definitely worth playing with. I think the more you use them, the more you'll understand them. And there's a lot you can do with CSS animations before you have to jump into JavaScript. But then there's a hell of a lot more you can do with JavaScript because you can kind of control it a little bit more each step. But I try to stay in CSS animation when I can because I really just don't want to pull in more JavaScript if I don't have to, I think. But yeah. A couple different resources. This article goes super into like kind of how to use all the different pieces of it. So explaining like the keyframes block and all the different properties and explaining how you can use them. Pretty good kind of place to get started. There's also this CSS Animations Rock website. And this guy has like a newsletter that he sends articles, tips, and tutorials through. He also has a couple of courses that I really enjoyed, just for kind of looking at all different types of animation. He starts with CSS, but some of them get a little bit more into it, but there's definitely some really cool examples in here to look through and get some inspiration from. And when you don't want to write all the animations for yourself, this is a fun, small library that you can get started with. It's apparently a Just Add Water CSS animation site. So basically, you kind of come through, you pick which one you want to use, and it just shows you what it does. And so it's kind of figured out a lot of those curves for you so that you don't have to think about it, and is a really easy way to kind of get started with. Some of these, like the little bounce back thing is one of those curves that my non-math brain just doesn't want to figure out. But this can be a quick way to get started with adding some fun animations in. And I think that's most of what I got for my slides. I'll see if there's any questions, I guess.
Can you go back in time and prevent me from wasting a bunch of time doing something in JavaScript that maybe could have been handled by animation play state? I might Google it afterwards just to feel bad about myself. I don't know.
You can definitely, it's definitely more powerful to use it in JavaScript, but you can get a lot of mileage out of the CSS version of it. I think a lot of people jump into animation and they think, oh, moving pieces, I have to use JavaScript for this. And I think it can actually be really helpful to learn what you can do with CSS first. so that you don't run for the big JavaScript tool when you maybe don't need it for some of these kind of more simple things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that's something it's funny because CSS is like you learn it so early on in kind of your web development career a lot of times, and then you feel like, okay, I've got that down, but it's kind of infinite in a weird way. There's so much CSS to learn.
There is so much to learn, and there's so many new pieces that are coming out still. But since it's not like a big flashy title like CSS4, because that's not a thing, it's hard to kind of keep track of what's new in CSS and things like that sometimes. I might obsess over it occasionally and pay attention to it too much and try all kinds of CSS that's not supported yet, but eventually. But it's a lot of fun, and CSS is way more powerful. Like, you do learn it so early that everyone thinks it's like super simple and like, oh, it's a basic thing. But it gets really in depth, and you can do a lot of really cool stuff with it.
Can you show us how you changed the color on that shape with the code you had up for the code pen?
Ooh, good one. So I'm using this filter and hue rotate. So filter is kind of this cool way to do, to change coloring on code. You can apply it to like an image. So if you have an image that is, a colored image, you can apply a filter grayscale to it and turn it to a black and white image just kind of on the fly with code, which can be really cool because a lot of times I've seen where like your images are black and white, and then when you hover over them, it turns into the color. Well, instead of having to actually upload 2 different images, which is a lot of bandwidth and a lot of stuff for the user to have to download onto the page, you're just loading one image, and then you're using this filter property to change the color. So it has a lot of like kind of pre-built filters, not quite as exciting as Instagram's filters, but kind of the same idea, where you can change like the saturation, you can change the grayscale. If I was doing this with an image instead of just a color, the hue rotate would kind of like warp all the colors, and it gets a little funky. But there's a lot of them that are out there, and they're really fun to use. Let's see if I can find any of the fun ones. So like here's an image that uses the hue rotate. So instead of the regular kind of icon that you're used to, it's using the rotate to shift the colors like that. You can change the contrast. You can actually blur images using the filter. You can add shadows and invert it. Like this is doing 2 different things. So it's adding the shadow, but it's also inverting your colors in the image. And you can apply this to kind of any type of image that you would load, or just kind of how I was doing, where I just put it on a div that has a colored background, and I used it to change the color that way. It's a fun little thing that CSS has that most people have not seen before. But yeah, there's a whole bunch. You can do the sepia, saturation, the grayscale, invert it, change the opacity, all kinds of stuff. And then, reset it when you've done all kinds of craziness and you don't know what to change back. So cool. I will throw a link to my slides over in the chat.
Do you want to show us maybe some of your animations on your website?
Sure. So these ones are mostly using JavaScript, but I love my fish that kind of swims and the bubbles that go back and forth. I'm using opacity to make the different stickers load in. I'm playing with kind of the rotate and the scale, which are the cheap animations on my social buttons. So they spin upside down and change colors when you hover over them. I might have been having too much fun with all of this. Things like that. Most of my stuff's actually on CodePen, I think. My friend was doing a lot of hand lettering, and so I decided I wanted to try it, but I wanted to do it on the computer. So I took a quote and I made my own animation for the hand lettering. And it's actually, like, even though I'm using JavaScript, it's really not that much code. Like, for all of those balloons and everything and stuff, it's still like only 100 lines of code, which I thought was pretty cool. This is another one. I use a lot of SVGs to kind of create the starting points, but they can be animated pretty easily. So here I have my little plant that kind of shakes a little bit. And so if you hover over it to see why it's shaking, a little bee will fly out of it and go check out the flower and eventually leave your little terrarium. But just like a lot of, I have a lot of fun with these kind of little ones. I'm definitely using GreenSock for a lot of these more complicated ones where I have all these different steps, which is a really cool library if you're going to do JavaScript for your animations. But there's this one that I'm in the middle of working on. It draws the animation, like it draws my thing for you. Another fish tank, because apparently that's all I like to animate. So I've gotten about as far as it draws it. Now, next it's going to color it in, and then the fish are going to start swimming. Replace the small one that I have on my website. Playing with animation is just a lot of fun. The person who does all the really cool animation stuff, let's see.
Sarah?
Yeah. But she does all kinds of crazy animation stuff. Most of hers is the JavaScript stuff, but I can actually find her instead of like tributes and happy birthdays to her. But she does a lot of really cool stuff. I want to find person, not but yeah, she does a lot of really cool animation. That's definitely worth checking out. Yeah. I have another animation talk that I'll probably do as part of this meetup down the line, where I go into the JavaScript stuff and how you can kind of work with SVGs and get a little bit more in depth and do some of these more complex animations that I really wouldn't want to do in CSS. So if there's interest for it, I will definitely do that down the line. So I think the link I shared for my slides, if you take out the CSS animation part of it and just go to the main slides website, there's a lot of resources from some of my other talks. If you want to go look at the JavaScript one, it's the Animating Your Portfolio to Awesome with GSAP, which is the GreenSock library. I definitely stole some slides from there. So there will be a little bit of overlap, but also goes into a lot of the JavaScript stuff. So yeah. I'm really bad at presenting. The first time I had to give a talk, I didn't know how to end my talk or tell everybody that I was done. So I kind of stood up on one leg and put my arms in the air and said ta-da, and just stood there and nobody knew how to handle that. So I was just kind of like awkwardly balancing until I lost my balance and fell over, waiting for people to be like, oh yeah, you're done, cool, clap, whatever. And I've gotten better at it, but now I'm like sitting on a computer and it's less of the feedback, so I'm feeling awkward again, but that's cool. This was fun.
It's maybe more awkward because of the computer, although like if you're nervous, like I sweat when I'm nervous, so no one can see. Maybe it's better. I don't know.
Yeah, I've gotten so used to the feedback of like seeing the reactions, and only having a few faces is a little different, but hopefully this was still a good format and people got a lot out of this. We'll definitely be back next month working on speakers for that, but have a couple cool people lined up, just working on getting the dates. But yeah, and in 2 weeks, I should post this in the next day or two, but we'll be doing the online version of Puppies and Portfolios, which is definitely a more laid back event instead of sitting and presenting. It's a quick lightning talk on some kind of portfolio subject, and mostly working with you guys to figure out kind of what do you want to learn for your portfolio site? How can we help you build that? Whether you need more design help, or if you want more coding help with it, or just like, what the hell do I do with a portfolio? So my dogs come and hang out and we build portfolios, and we'll figure that out, how they show up on a computer meeting, but you know, it works. So yeah, thank you everyone for coming. If you have more questions about CSS or want to talk about anything CSS, go find me online and bug me, because it's my favorite thing to talk about. And thank you, Katie, for coming and presenting.
Thanks everyone for
You guys did a
listening to
great
me.
job.
Thanks for having me.
It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Oh yeah.
I will definitely be bugging you about CSS. I'm a web development student right now.
Awesome. Yeah. I've spent a lot of time working with bootcamp students and portfolios and stuff like that, but anything CSS I've taught at a couple code schools, so
Cool.
love to talk about it.
Well, nice hanging with all of you online. I'm gonna drop off, but yes, it's time for me to leave the house for the first time today and walk the dog. Very excited.
Yeah, I think it's
is there a way to save the chat so we have all the links that were posted?
I will make sure that they all get posted in the meetup page.
Okay, thank you.
Because I think it's a little bit more permanent.
I was seeing it was kind of hard to copy when I
Yeah,
tried.
that's why I wanted to save, because I
Yeah.
couldn't copy.
Yeah.
What happens in Zoom stays in Zoom.
I guess so.
Well, I think it's maybe how the Zoom meeting was set up, because in other chats, there's normally 3 dots down here by where you type in, and you can click on the dots and save, but it's not there now.
I don't know. But I'll make sure that both of our slide links get posted in Meetup.
Great.
So we at least have that.
And okay, thank you. There's other links though in the chat, so that's why I was wondering.
I don't know.
Okay, thanks anyway.
I'm pretty new to Zoom, so I still working on figuring all that out.
I think we're all getting used to it.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. And thank you all for coming, and yeah.
Thank you.
A lot of fun.
Thank you.
Do you want to stop the recording?
Yes, probably. Where is that button?
If you can't see it, I see it, but